November 1942, they crossed an ocean to fight Hitler, only to discover the most shocking truth waiting for them on British soil. For the first time in their lives, they weren't treated as second-class men, and that terrified some American officers far more than any German bomb. The fog came first. It rolled in from the Bristol Channel like a slow, deliberate tide, thick, cold, and ghost-pale, curling around the docks as if searching for something lost. In the half-light of a November dawn, the shapes of incoming transport ships rose from the mist like steel phantoms returning from another world. Their engines groaned against the quiet, and the smell of salt, fuel, and wet rope drifted through the air. Packed inside those ships were hundreds of American soldiers. Men in olive-drab uniforms who had traveled 3,000 miles to fight in a war that was never fully theirs. And standing among them, gripping the railing, was Sergeant James Holey of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, a carpenter's son from Birmingham, Alabama, who had never seen buildings older than the country he came from. The English shoreline stunned him. The brick warehouses were centuries old, blackened by soot and scarred by nightly Luftwaffe raids. Chimneys leaned, windows rattled, and yet the city stood its ground with the stubbornness of a people who had learned to live with danger. James felt the ship lurch as it docked. The clang of metal against steel echoed through the fog. He remembered his mother's last words before he boarded the train south. "Don't forget who you are." As if he could. As if the segregated waiting rooms, the whites-only signs in the separate army barracks hadn't already carved that message into him, like initials in pinewood. But stepping onto British soil with 200 other black soldiers, he sensed something unfamiliar in the air, something that made him straighten his shoulders despite the cold. Freedom? No, not freedom, just the absence of certain chains. Dock workers paused as the black soldiers descended the gangway. They stared, yes, but not with the sharp, suspicious hostility James knew from home. Their expressions were puzzled, curious, like someone seeing snow for the first time. One man with a cigarette dangling from his lips muttered, "Blimey, didn't know they were sending colored lads." Then he shrugged and went right back to unloading crates. No threats, no slurs barked through clenched teeth, no sheriffs watching from the corner of their eyes. Just work to be done. Behind James, Private Carter whispered, "Hell, they look at us less funny than folks back home." James didn't answer. He couldn't, because for the first time since he joined the army, he felt the weight of something he hadn't expected. Being treated like a soldier, not a problem. But that brief, fragile feeling wouldn't last. Within hours, American military police would storm through British pubs, furious at the sight of black GIs drinking beside white British women. British locals would argue, sometimes even fistfight, American officers over how those men were treated. James Holey hadn't come to Europe looking for a different kind of war, but he was about to walk straight into one. James traded a glance with Private Marcus Wright, a Georgian sharecropper's grandson who'd managed 3 years of high school before the draft pulled him in. Neither spoke. Both knew better than to trust moments that felt too easy. The first week blurred into routine, setting up anti-aircraft posts around Bristol, raising barrage balloons, learning to move through a blackout city still scarred from bombings. But what unsettled them most were the small, ordinary acts of decency. A pub owner who served them without hesitation. An elderly woman who asked where they came from, genuinely curious. Children who followed them down the streets, fascinated, wanting to touch their uniforms in their hands, treating them like visitors, not threats. "It's like they don't know the rules," Marcus said one moonlit night as they walked back to the barracks. James thought of the young woman he'd seen outside a cinema earlier, white, maybe 19, who had simply smiled at him. Not a fearful grimace, not a warning glance, just a smile. "Maybe they don't," he answered. "Maybe that's the problem." The problem became clear quickly. American military police started patrolling British cities where black troops were stationed, behaving as if Jim Crow extended across the Atlantic. They tried to segregate pubs and pressure owners to refuse service to black GIs. They warned British women away from black soldiers. But the British resisted. The mayor of Bristol issued a statement: all Allied soldiers would be served. Bath pubs posted signs, "all welcome." British women kept dancing. Stories spread fast. A British bouncer in Liverpool physically removed a white MP who tried to drag out a black soldier. A village council outside London refused to support segregated facilities. British MPs in Bath escorted white American officers out of a club meant for Black GIs when they tried to shut it down. It was a strange kind of battle, fought not with weapons but with customs, with simple human respect used as rebellion. James experienced it himself one cold December night at a dance in Colston Hall. The ballroom throbbed with Glenn Miller, crowded with black soldiers and British women seeking a moment of normal life amid the war. James stood against the wall until a blonde girl in a green dress approached him. "You planning to stand there all night?" she teased, hand extended. He followed her to the floor and, for 3 minutes, danced with a white woman. No shouting, no threats, no danger. When the music stopped, she thanked him and vanished into the crowd, leaving him stunned by a world where such a thing could happen without consequence. But the consequences returned. James saw an MP beat a black soldier outside a pub simply for drinking there. Then another soldier attacked for the same reason. By the third incident, James was no longer shocked, just exhausted. British people protested in editorials and broadcasts. Soldiers and civilians argued, sometimes fought, with American MPs. Towns organized dances specifically for Black GIs as a form of quiet defiance. Rumors began to circulate. Stories of high-ranking British officials pushing back, of liaison officers refusing segregated meetings, of the king questioning American racial policies. Most were probably embellished, but one tale spread widely enough that men half believed it. In January 1943, word spread through the black units stationed across Britain, first as whispers over mess hall tables, then as confident retellings shared around pot-bellied stoves. By the time it reached the ears of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Morrison of the 92nd Infantry Division, the story had become something close to legend. Morrison stood before a barracks full of soldiers that winter evening, the wind rattling the thin walls as he spoke. His voice carried the weight of an officer who had seen far too many things he could not change. He told them what he'd heard from a trusted aide. During a planning meeting in London, a British colonel had paused the discussion to ask how many black units would soon be arriving. The American commander explained matter-of-factly the logistics of segregation, in housing, in recreation, in access to facilities. It was simply the system, he said, as though describing the weather. According to Morrison, the British officer stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, in a tone cooler than the English winter outside, he said he found such policies intolerable on British soil. Britain did not enforce such divisions, he added, and the government did not recognize them. The room of soldiers listening to Morrison drew quiet, so quiet that the crackling of the stove became the loudest sound. And the rumor didn't stop there. Some claim that when word reached Buckingham Palace, the Queen herself asked for assurance that black American troops would be treated with the same dignity as any Allied soldier arriving to defend British cities. Whether she'd spoken those precise words didn't matter. The mere idea that someone, anyone, at the highest level had objected meant something. That night, Sergeant James Holey lay awake in his bunk, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. The barracks smelled of wet wool and coal smoke, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Whether the Queen had truly intervened didn't concern him. What mattered was the possibility that someone with power had looked at men like him and said plainly that the system mistreating them was wrong. Not inconvenient, not complicated, wrong. By early spring, the 92nd Infantry Division was preparing to ship out to Italy to face the brutal mountain fighting ahead. Meanwhile, the barrage balloon units, James's unit, remained in Britain, tightening the steel cables, checking winches, maintaining the silent guardians floating above the cities. Days settled into a rhythm, days spent repairing torn balloon skins, greasing pulleys, tightening ropes, nights spent in pubs where British women laughed freely and asked them to dance, oblivious to the social earthquake their invitations would have caused in Alabama or Georgia. Dock workers bought drinks for them. British soldiers swapped trench stories with them, and every time an American military police patrol entered a pub and tried to separate Black GIs from the locals, the British grumbled loudly. sometimes stepping between the MPs and the men they insisted were their allies. "Cruel lot, your military police," one old dock worker once muttered, shaking his head. Yet every night James and the others marched back to segregated barracks, the cold reality waiting like a locked door. Britain treated them as men. America, their own uniform, still treated them as something less. And in that contradiction, James felt a new kind of war forming, one he never expected to fight. James saw the Queen Mother once, without realizing who she was at the time. She passed by during a visit to a Bristol hospital, her eyes sweeping over black and white soldiers alike with the same neutral acknowledgement. It was a tiny moment, but James carried it with him years later in Alabama, back under Jim Crow, working as a carpenter like his father. For a few months in England, he had been treated, if not consistently, then at least occasionally, as fully human. The experience lodged in him the knowledge that the system back home wasn't natural, just enforced. The war ended. The guns fell silent. The barrage balloons were hauled down, deflated, folded, and stored. The smoke that had once stained Britain's skies drifted away, revealing a country worn thin but still standing. Ships rolled across the Atlantic carrying soldiers back to the homeland they had left years earlier, victorious, exhausted, and forever changed. Everyone returned home. Life, as the newspapers like to say, moved on. Factories switched from tanks to tractors. Cities patched roofs and repainted walls. Children who had grown up beneath the wail of air raid sirens learned to sleep without fear. But for those who had lived through the strange, turbulent intersection of race, war, and duty, the memories lingered like ghost lights that never quite went out. British civilians remembered the young Black American soldiers most of all, not because they were unusual, but because they carried something different in their posture, a blend of confidence and caution, pride and restraint. Men who had come from a country that bruised them daily, but still expected them to defend its honor. Women remembered dancing with them in crowded pubs where the music was too loud and the floorboards shook beneath stomping boots. They remembered the smiles, the shy laughter, the thrill of doing something improper without feeling shame. Pubs themselves became part of the folklore. The ones that refused to enforce American segregation, turning MPs away with a firm, "Not here, not in this house." Bartenders would recall how American officers bristled, how British patrons pushed back, how the night resumed as if nothing unusual had occurred. Children remembered being lifted onto giant shoulders, given candy, taught handclaps in American slang. They had no understanding of race politics. They remembered kindness, not color. One boy decades later would tell a historian, "They were the first soldiers I wasn't afraid of." And the soldiers, the men who had crossed an ocean for a war that treated them better abroad than their own nation did at home, carried memories as sharp as broken glass. They remembered what it felt like to walk into a pub and be served without hesitation, to stand in line beside white British soldiers and not be pushed aside, to dance freely without a sheriff's glare or a club owner pointing to a whites-only sign, to be seen beyond their skin, if only for a fleeting moment in history. They came home changed, not because racism had vanished. It hadn't. Many returned to the very same segregated buses, diners, and barracks they had left. But because they now knew the world could be different, that it had been different, briefly, in a battered island where bombs fell nightly, but people still found room for dignity. Many wondered about the rumor that had circulated since 1943, the tale of a British colonel confronting an American commander, refusing to permit segregation on British soil. The whispered claim that the Queen herself, upon hearing that Black American troops were arriving, asked whether they would be treated with the respect due to any Allied soldier. Whether she had actually spoken those words was impossible to confirm. No record existed, no official note, just the persistence of the story, carried across barracks, retold in camps, repeated in pubs, surviving across generations. But the truth of the quote mattered less than what it represented. It symbolized a possibility, a world where power could defend justice instead of hierarchy, a moment where someone important might have said, "Not here, not to them." For men told all their lives that their worth was negotiable, that they were tolerated rather than valued, that their uniforms did not erase their color. That belief mattered more than any medal pinned to their chest. Some of them clung to that story like a rope in deep water. Others treated it as a quiet comfort, a reminder that the world was not universally rigged against them. And some, hardened by experience, dismissed it as rumor. But even they carried the memory of how Britain had felt and how different that feeling was from home. And even if nothing changed when they returned to America, even if they found the same old lines drawn across train cars, the same signs above water fountains, the same narrowed eyes waiting for them in their hometowns, they carried one unshakable truth: that in 1943, on an island battered by war and blackened by bombs, they had been treated like men. Not boys, not problems, not intruders. Men. And that, in its own quiet way, was a victory. A victory not recorded in history books, overshadowed by battles and generals, but carried forever in the memories of those who lived it. For some, it became the seed of conviction that would later feed the civil rights movement. For others, it remained a private warmth, a reminder that somewhere in the world, across an ocean, they had once stepped into a pub and been greeted with a smile rather than suspicion. The war had ended, but what they learned overseas, that stayed with them for the rest of their lives.